Welcome to episode 476. Today, we have a follow-up on the story about Josh McDowell from the last episode. New Pew research about evangelicals is being spun by both pro-Trumpers and ex-vangelicals to support their own positions. Then I talked to best-selling Christian author and one of my heroes, Philip Yancey, about his new memoir, and what wisdom he has to share with the millions of us struggling with evangelicalism as someone who's walked the path before us. All of that, plus a new batch of animal and butt news, and Phil doubles down on his feud with the Dutch. Here is episode 476.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I am here with Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Sky. And hey, Jason, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks. Nice to see you. And from an undisclosed location that we're about to find out, Christian, what's your middle initial?
J, it's Johnson.
J.
Unless you want to do my prior
Oh,
middle
I
initial,
see.
which was Clark, was my middle name. Christian Clark Johnson Taylor.
Christian Clark Johnson Taylor.
Is that more of a Southern thing?
Clark? Was it Clark is your middle name? Wait, back up.
That
Did you say
sounds like
Clark?
a clothing brand.
Yeah,
Is that-
Clark is my middle name. And quite funnily, is funnily a word? Quite
No.
interestingly, I have that name because a couple gave my parents, actually, my parents met a couple on a trip they were given to Hawaii, and their name was Clark, and they became friends with them. And that's how I got named.
What? So it's not like a family name. It isn't like your mom's maiden name or something.
Your parents were drunk in Hawaii, met somebody, said, you're going to be the middle name of our next child, regardless of gender.
Yep. It's either that they met them in Hawaii or they gave them the tickets to Hawaii. That might be more possible, but I don't know.
So they
Anyway,
named their child after them?
yeah,
That's just-
yeah. And
I
my
don't know what to
first
think
name,
about that.
Christian, you would love it if my parents were Christians and they named me Christian. But no, what happened was my mother watched a movie with Tuesday Weld called something about the rookie, I think. I can't remember. Anyway, the main character was Tuesday Weld. Do you remember that actress?
Yeah,
No.
I think so.
Tuesday Weld. And her name was Christian in the movie. My mother thought it was cool, and that's how I got that name.
Well, you could have been named Tuesday, I suppose.
You could have just been named Clark.
Well,
Here we are with Clark Taylor. Okay, it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, Clark, where are you?
Tuesday, Clark.
Yes, Tuesday Clark. I am in this tiny little adorable town called Apeldoorn in the Netherlands. It's a little
Oh, that's
bit.
where you were last week. So you're
Yeah.
still in the same place. You're still
I'm
in
still in the same
Apeldoorn.
place.
I
I
thought
am
you
a
just
bit-
carried that little picture behind you around everywhere and
And
put it
hung
on
it
the
around.
wall.
No. I'm in the most adorable little Airbnb. I mean, people need to come here just to see how organized, clean the Dutch people are, and nice. But
Did you check their teeth?
they all have super nice teeth, and they all
Okay.
smell really good. I mean, and I wish I could show you. They probably shave their legs too, but I wish I could tell you that.
Even the men. And they're all named Clark.
I don't understand this, but over a week ago, like 8 days ago, when I first got here, I bought a thing of flowers, like, you get at the grocery store at Mariano's.
Sure.
So I bought one of those and I put it in a little coffee cup. It is 8 days later and they look absolutely brand new. And I don't know what they do with Dutch flowers, but I'm certainly thinking that America needs to figure it out. Because when I get those in the United States, in 2 days, they're dead.
Maybe
okay.
it's the supply chain. Maybe the flower supply chain in the Netherlands is so advanced from, they used to use tulip bulbs as currency. So clearly flowers are very important to them. And there you go. Some people were mad at me for denigrating wooden shoes last week. Believe it or not, some Dutch people. Wouldn't you expect that to be the case? Because they need to keep the fiction going that they actually wore those, and it's not just for tourists.
Okay.
Phil, I don't know if you want to double down on that
No,
and go
but
to war with the Dutch.
hang on. Let me
Oh,
just say.
come on.
Let me
Come
just
on.
say this. Let me say this. Listen to this. This is going to
Yes.
blow your mind, Phil.
Yes.
So, I'm here in the Netherlands because I'm doing the story of on the Brave Dutch. And
Yes.
so we've been following John Lau's journey after his plane was downed. And so there are many Dutch people that helped him along the way. And so we have the addresses of some of those homes. And so we've been ferreting them out and going up and knocking on the doors. It's been very exciting. And yesterday we
And then
found
smearing them with beans. Is there any bean smearing in the process?
No. So
Okay.
we went up to this one farm. Jacob Boll was a Dutch man that helped hide American airmen. And we went to the door, and it turns out Jacob Boll's son is still on this farm. And so we
Wow.
went to meet him, and he had never heard about his father's story. We told him what his father had done, and he began to cry. He was very overwhelmed. And I asked if I could take a picture with them. And so he came outside and he put on his
No.
wooden
No.
shoes. Yes.
Because you were a tourist. You said,
No.
"Oh, American.
Nope.
American.
They
I'll
were
put on."
sitting. They were
That's not
sitting
a
by
Dutch
his
accent.
door, and he uses them to put his like to go outside quickly and like feed the dog or water the
Okay.
plants. And they were all dirty and scuffed up, and so he still wears his wooden shoes.
Okay. What's one thing we know about the human foot? One thing we know about the human foot. I'll tell you what
Smells.
it is. Okay, that's another thing. Okay, what are two things we know about the human foot? Number one, it smells. Number two, it bends in the middle. Okay, what's one thing we know about wooden shoes?
They don't.
They don't bend in the middle. So,
Yeah,
well,
but you know what? You can think about Crocs. Crocs don't bend in the
yes,
middle.
they
Sure
do.
they
They're made of
do.
foam. They bend everywhere.
It's a Nerf football on your
That's
foot.
that's
Okay,
why
all
I
right,
made
fine,
this.
fine. But take the like wedges that women wear. We wear
Yeah.
wedges all the time. They do not bend in the middle. So that argument
Can I
actually
just
does
say
not hold
something?
water.
I don't think there are a whole lot of things that women put on their feet that do not respect the anatomy of a foot. So, or the anatomy of the body. So I don't think we can use that as an argument for wooden shoes. I'm just going to hold my position. I'm going to hold my position until a Dutch person knocks it off of me that wooden shoes were invented for the tourism industry.
Phil, I don't know if you want to pick this fight because it's a
Yes.
verifiable fact that the Dutch are
No.
the tallest people in the world.
They sure
Right,
are.
because then they would be stunted if they actually wore those wooden shoes regularly and not just when tourists come over. Okay.
And Christian, by the way, from the same website, the Netherlands export more flowers than any other nation in the world.
Well, we certainly aren't getting the good ones then because
Well,
ours.
it just takes them, that whole week where they're looking great is the week they're on a boat from the Netherlands
Oh,
to my jewel.
maybe. But I have something to show you. I just want you to look really quickly.
Yeah.
Look at
Oh, you're
this.
showing us some wooden shoes. I see
Those
them.
are the wooden shoes that Jacob Boll's son wore. Look at that. They're
Okay.
dirty. They're
Do they
Yeah.
have a
on.
liner on the inside, or is it just wood?
No, it's
Yeah.
just wood.
No, it's
Look at
just
that.
wood. It's just wood. That looks exactly like what I want to do yard work in.
Hey, to their
Just
credit, those are probably going to last a long time.
two little wooden bathtubs. Yeah, I got a pair of nice work boots that I've had for about 20 years, so don't even start with me. And they bend in the middle where my foot does. They respect the foot. Okay, and now it's time for news of the butt.
And now it's time for news of the butt.
No. No,
Are you
please tell me
okay?
no. I was loving your animal news, Phil.
Are you okay?
Couldn't
Are
you
you
save
okay?
this for Caitlin? Why do I have to be here?
Scientists working on toilet that identifies you by your butt.
What? No, we do not need this.
Is this a new iPhone security feature?
Oh, that's funny. Researchers want to give the toilet a smart makeover, but we're not talking about heated seats or bidet attachments. According to the Stanford School of Medicine, researchers are developing a scanner that can recognize the user's unique anal print.
Oh
Okay,
my
I
gosh.
do not even want to talk about this. We are done. We're done. Let's move on. What you got next, Phil Vischer?
So now we've just learned something. We've already learned something today. I didn't know I had a unique one of those. Did you know? Do you know that humans were like snowflakes? None of us.
What do you think about this? Phil, now I can't get it out of my brains. And now our
None of us.
listeners are going to have to imagine
Yes.
their unique print.
Your butt is like a beautiful snowflake. There's
Oh
no
my
other butt.
gosh.
Thethere's no other butt like your butt.
Maybe this is what dogs have always known.
And so
Oh, Scott.
So what researchers have done is they've built a toilet that has a little camera in it and apparently a light, because once you sit down, I don't think a camera works very well without a light. So you've got a lit up toilet.
This sounds dangerously like the mark of the beast.
Doesn't I think everything sounds like the mark of the beast to you, Sky Jatani. Everything does.
You know what, Phil? I think this is like Babylon Bee news. This is real news. And this is The Onion. You are reading The Onion, aren't you?
Co-founder Sonia Grego, the co-founder of Caprata, a Duke University-affiliated physiological monitoring startup, how many of those have we bumped into, wants to revolutionize the way we do our business by scanning samples of your poop and urine for health indicators, including chronic diseases and even cancer. So they're working on toilets that will scan whatever you put in it to look for flags for health issues. But then how do you know which person left that in the toilet, unless you can do a butt scan and identify them from their unique fingerprint on their butt?
Anal print.
I wasn't going to say that again, Sky. I was not going to say that again, and you just said that again.
Well, you're the one being we have to be anatomically correct with our feet. Why don't we have to be anatomically correct with,
with how we talk about our,
So if you have abnormal patterns, it's capable of documenting the patterns of what's coming out of you and linking them to your medical file, because it knows, I'd know that butt. Your toilet says, I'd know that butt anywhere. That's George. That's Clark.
A couple of things. Number one.
Yes, Christian.
Different things come out of our butts.
You can say it. Say butt.
Butts all the time. And there's lots of different reasons for that, depending on what we eat, or if we have a bug or whatever. However,
or a ladybug.
I will say that if I could trade out having a colonoscopy for the butt scan, I might be interested.
Yes, I hear you. It's a much less invasive camera. So what the idea is that smart toilets can help you track your health, but they need to know who you are when you sit down. So a quick butt scan and you can unlock your bank account.
I have a terrible fear that this is going to be used against us.
I do too.
You think so?
If I were to be killed in a horrible accident, and the coroner's like, "I'm sorry, ma'am, we can only identify him by his butt print."
That's all we had left. All we had left of him was his butt. But here it is.
They're going to be able to track you. Like if you use a public toilet somewhere and it takes a picture of your anal print.
Then they say, what was he doing here at this time?
And then the government can track you.
Yes. Needless to say, some privacy experts are concerned.
Yeah, you think?
Yeah. There's nothing more private than your privates.
But let me ask you
more
this.
Private. Wait a minute. We have to enjoy Sky's last statement. There's nothing more private than your privates.
That's a good one.
This has been the news of the butt.
This has been the news of the butt.
You started it, Phil.
I apologize. I apologize, America. I apologize. Okay, but this
You're not apologizing to Europe. You better apologize to the whole world at this point.
I'm apologizing to the whole world except for the Dutch, because you're still trying to pull a fast one with those wooden shoes. Okay. Animal news. You said you wanted animal news. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. This is good news, Christian. This is exciting news, especially if you own a sick hamster. Llama antibodies treat hamsters COVID-19. Did you hear? Do you want me to say that again?
Wait. Who has COVID-19? The hamsters?
The hamsters.
Okay, I don't want to be insensitive, but who cares?
You are insensitive, Sky. That is insensitive. Some little girl
Wow.
who has a hamster is going to really care.
Wait
Yes.
a minute. There are 700,000 Americans who have died. 1 in 500 Americans have died from COVID, and we're worried about hamsters?
Hey, you. Hey, you. First, turn down your mic a little bit. You're a little hot. And
He is hot.
you are hot. And secondly, now all the Dutch people that were mad at me, who are also hamster owners, are now mad at you instead. So I'm good. New research demonstrates that hamsters given llama antibodies suffer fewer effects when infected with SARS-CoV than their untreated counterparts, and pre-dosing can stop them from getting sick altogether. Now, why llama antibodies, do you ask, Christian
Why?
Clark
Yeah, absolutely.
Johnson?
I'm sitting here going, why
Taylor?
llama antibodies?
Human antibodies, like those of most mammals, are made up of double chains of proteins. Llamas and alpacas have these too, but also produce antibodies known as nanobodies that contain just a single protein chain. Llamas and alpacas have nanobodies. Keep your
They have
hands off
actually
my
bigger
nanobodies.
bodies than most people I know.
That's because llamas are aliens.
They are aliens. Nanobodies are widely used for diagnosis since they do a better job of distinguishing between some viruses than double chain normal antibodies.
Oh my gosh, Phil, all I'm hearing right now is blah, 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 blah,
Bodies,
blah.
bodies,
because
bodies. Okay.
It just makes no sense.
Here's what you need to know. Llamas have special antibodies, and they've cured COVID or greatly reduced the impact of COVID in hamsters that were infected in COVID. So the leap is it will work in people too. That's the idea, not just hamsters.
Oh,
but if
okay.
you have here's the first lesson. If you have a sick hamster, you need to buy a llama and have the llama spit on the hamster, and the hamster will get better. Okay, here's the second lesson. They may be able to turn this into a nasal spray because this is what's exciting. Llama nanobodies and their artificial versions, and they're making some artificial versions of llama nanobodies because, of course, why wouldn't you? And I'm sure there'll be no side effects that they didn't predict about the artificial versions, have several advantages as treatments compared to monoclonal antibodies from recovered patients, which is what we're using right now. They don't need cold storage. Llama antibodies are used to being outside, so they don't need to be kept cold, which makes transportation easier. But perhaps more importantly, they can be administered through a nasal spray, so you wouldn't have to get an injection. You could just have a llama spit up your nose, and then you won't get COVID.
I don't think the people who are resisting the vaccine are doing so because they're afraid of needles.
This isn't a vaccine.
Okay,
Sky.
whatever. It's a treatment.
It's a treatment, yeah. Yeah. And there are a lot of people that are doing the monoclonal antibodies, but won't do the vaccine.
Right.
So this makes it easier if they can get it to work, if they can, work out all the problems. I don't know about you. Were any of you at the zoo on Saturday with your grandson? I was. Jason?
Not me.
No,
No,
none
no.
of you. None of
Which
you were at the
zoo?
zoo on Saturday.
What zoo?
Actually, I was at Causley on Saturday and Brookfield on Sunday, but that's a different story. Why that
Well,
happened?
Wow.
I will say what's out in my backyard over here are 2 Egyptian goats, a palomino, and another horse that I can't mention. And I've been using them as my own personal petting zoo. So yeah, I think I was at a
Is the other
petting
horse
zoo.
naughty? Is it a naughty horse?
No,
Who can't be mentioned?
It's a version of a Netherland horse that I've never heard of before.
Oh,
so
okay.
its name did not stick in my brain.
That really does not help us with our COVID crisis at all. Doesn't
No,
help
but
us
you
with our
asked
COVID.
who was at a petting zoo, and I said I was.
Okay, I hear you. So I was at the Causley Zoo with Micah, my 20-month-old grandson, and they had llamas there. And so we were looking at the llamas, and the llamas, one of them would come up strangely close to your face, and someone asked the attendant, why is he doing that? And they said, llamas want to greet you or get to know you by smelling your breath. That's what he said. That's weird. And then we
Horses
watched
are like that.
him, and he did that. He went right up to people and then smelled their breath and then kind of looked at him and said, all right, now I know everything about you. So I'm wondering if llamas can smell COVID in your breath and then could be trained to then spit antibodies up your nose, and we could release a herd of llamas like in, vaccine resistant states to cure the COVID crisis, and they go around sniffing for COVID and then spitting antibodies up people's noses.
You sound like you have been working on Donald Trump's medical staff.
I'm
Oh.
not sure he'd let that many llamas in from South America, though.
Oh, ding, 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 ding. All right, that's my animal news. I'm done with that. I don't know if you guys really appreciate the work I put into these stories and the research
Philly, I have to be honest
that
with
I
you.
do.
I don't necessarily know that I admire all the research, but I do give you credit. I do give you credit for the humor
Oh, thank you.
that
Well,
they
thank you.
bring and your
I
funny
appreciate that.
way of thinking about things.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you, Christian Clark Johnson Taylor.
Hey, you remembered my name.
I know. I'm going to refer to you as that, I think, forevermore. No, Christian Clark Johnson Taylor. We talked about Josh McDowell last week because he kind of stepped in it with some somewhat retrograde beliefs that he stated in a talk he gave about minorities and their disinterest in education and aspiring towards good lives. I don't know if you heard what happened since then, but he actually first he issued a statement apologizing and said those statements didn't reflect my beliefs, which is a little odd. After that, he issued a statement saying he was actually suspending his ministry and taking a step back from ministry to spend some time educating himself and listening to people. So he took himself off the road and it said, and this, I got to give it to him. More people were willing to say, okay, people have pointed out an area of ignorance that I have and that I might actually be doing damage as I'm speaking because of my ignorance. So I'm just going to be quiet for a little while and listen. That's an idea.
Isn't that a kind of boilerplate response in some quarters when you make an insensitive statement to say I'm going to take a season to listen?
Well, yeah, but
Listen, I would not discount him. I was thinking about this.
yeah.
I kind of feel bad last week about my sort of. I made a statement where I said, well, he's not invited over to my house anymore or something like that. And I started thinking about that. He is over in his 80s, right? Something
Yeah,
like that.
82.
Yeah, he's 82. And I do think that we probably ought to be a little bit more compassionate and understanding for the older generation as they process all of this new information and stuff. And I particularly give him a lot of credit if he's going to say, I'm going to educate myself about this. So I'm with you, Phil, on this one. I think that not necessarily does he get an all out pass, but I do think we ought to take what he said in context a little bit. And I think we ought to wait and see. And I think we ought to give him kudos because that's the Christian response, right?
What do you make of those who are saying that this is an example of cancel culture? You think that applies?
He stepped back himself. He voluntarily stepped back. So no, I don't think that applies. I don't think if he lost his job, if he lost, like, he may have come under some pressure from Campus Crusade crew, like the cool kids say, because he's still technically part of their ministry. So they have some sort of, I don't know, oversight authority, but I imagine they did not want to be closely associated with the positions he was taking. So we don't really know what happened behind closed doors.
Sure.
But it seems to be on his part some genuine, statement of, okay, I need to learn more. I need to, and the fact that he's willing to stop traveling and speaking for a season to learn more. I don't think it's, I agree with you, Christian. I don't think it's new information that he doesn't have. It's just because, the history of how Americans have treated Black people is not new information, that we just uncovered. But many of us were raised in such a kind of filtered bubble of historical knowledge that it becomes new information for some of us through a fault of our own cultures.
Right.
I
right?
agree, and I affirm his decision to step back and listen and not get super defensive or justify his his words. That's all mature and appreciated. But here's the part I don't get. Um,
Yes.
he is 82 years old, and
Yeah.
he presented himself as an expert on what is threatening the church in America. And he spoke as an expert on what is threatening the church in America. And he presented the top threat as critical race theory. Given those parameters, I would expect someone who presents themselves that way to have studied and explored and researched the topic enough to present themselves as an expert on the topic. And yet his comments, by his own admission, were inaccurate and uninformed to the point where he needs to step back and listen. So I'm grateful he's doing that, but why then did he present himself as an expert on the topic in the first place? And he's not a 16-year-old who's shooting off
Mm-hmm.
the hip
Mm-hmm.
on something they heard, through the grapevine on social media. That's the part that I find a little bit troubling.
Well, it is possible, and here I'm going to be very vulnerable. It is possible to actually think you are an expert until you are shown that you are not. Because in my own work, and even when I married my husband, he used to say to me, you're talking like you absolutely know what you're talking about, but you really don't, do you? Because blah, blah, blah. And I really would talk like I knew what I was talking about and thought I was 100% sure of what I was saying until I was presented with new information that demonstrated I probably didn't have the whole picture. So it could be something like that, don't you think?
Yeah, and that's basically the premise of our whole podcast. However, However, if you, Christian, were being invited to be a keynote speaker at a conference on a topic, and you get up there and say, this is the number one threat to Christianity in America, I would hope that you've done your research, that you're not just kind of BSing everything. And I don't know if he
In
was.
his defense, he
Yeah.
listed his top five. He listed five threats to Christianity. The first one was CRT. He didn't say explicitly, and these are in order of severity. So we may be jumping to conclusions saying that he said CRT was the biggest threat. It was first on his list.
Okay, but it's in the top five.
Oh, definitely the top five.
And he's presenting himself as an authority on what the greatest threats are, which
Yeah.
means I expect him to be familiar with these threats and have studied them enough to identify them as threats. That's the problem.
Yes.
Like I completely affirm his decision, and I think it's a mature and proper response. There's no criticism there at all. It's another one of these cases of how did we get here in the first place? Like, can we do a little bit of reflective exploration of this and recognize that sometimes we we put people up on platforms who claim to be experts in something or who we want to be an expert in something, and they may not be.
Yeah, I think it may be because they didn't put him on the platform because he was an expert in CRT. Because I don't even know if they knew what he was going to talk about.
Well, yeah, but he was presenting himself as an expert
Yes.
on what is a threat to the church when his own comments verified he wasn't fully informed,
Yes. In
and
fact,
Can
by
I
his own
just ask
admission.
you? Let me ask you a quick question. I understand why many Christians are saying that CRT is a threat to our society or our economic systems. I'm trying to understand why there's a group of people saying that CRT is a threat to Christianity. How is that a threat to Christianity?
because it doesn't offer redemption. So it's the view that you're teaching an alternate gospel that has no redemption or forgiveness. It's complicated. it's kind of a
It's
stretch. You have to go around the pack, but you're basically saying, oh, you are now promoting that all white people are sinful, all non-white people are virtuous, and that white people cannot atone for their sin no matter what they do. So that's an alternate gospel, and you're undermining the church.
Okay, well, first of all, that's not what CRT says.
But some people who are in the movement that is associated with CRT will make statements like that. So, therefore, that must be representative of what CRT says.
Hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I am glad that he's stepping back and listening, and I hope the people he's listening to are really helpful and informative, and that he can get back out there and offer a more nuanced and thoughtful engagement on these topics, which I think the church needs, and his voice would be a welcome one in that conversation. But I do think we need to get out of our echo chambers a little bit and explore multiple facets to an idea before we put ourselves on a platform as an expert about it.
Right. But Sky, if my whole life is traveling and speaking about the dangers facing America and American families and the American church, how am I supposed to have time to learn about the things I'm talking about?
Yeah, heaven forbid.
I'm booked because I'm good at this.
The show must go on.
Okay, last thing I want to talk about. Last Friday, if you missed it, we have a new mini show that may be a monthly thing. We're not sure. We're taking it out for a test drive called French Friday or French Fry Day with David French, where Sky and David French sit down and talk about some of the issues in our society at that moment. Very timely, very now, very happening. And two stylish men sitting down for a stylish conversation. And one of the topics this week was the new Pew Research, and we didn't get a chance to talk about this on this podcast, the new Pew Research, which had some startling data. And I wanted to bring it up here on the main podcast because it's worth talking about, and also because other people are using the data in different ways, some even using it to try to discredit David French, our very own French fry. So here's the results of the survey. There has been no large-scale departure from evangelicalism among white Americans since the election of Donald Trump. In fact, there is solid evidence that white Americans who viewed Trump favorably and did not identify as evangelicals in 2016 were actually much more likely than white Trump skeptics to begin identifying as born-again or evangelical Protestants by 2020. White evangelicals who opposed Trump were significantly more likely than Trump supporters to drop the evangelical label. So there was no mass departure of white Americans from evangelical Protestantism between 2016 and 2020. In 2016 survey, 25% described themselves as born again or evangelical Protestants. And by 2020, that was up to 29%. So it appears rather than, so some of us were crying out, this is going to kill the church. Everyone's going to run away from the church because of the close political association with Donald Trump. This survey says, maybe the opposite happened. Maybe it actually attracted more people to start calling themselves evangelicals. Okay. Sky, what was your initial reaction to reading that?
A rose by any other name. It's this. You can call yourself whatever you want, but it doesn't make it.
Was that a Dutch reference?
Change. What's that?
Was that a Dutch reference?
No, that was a Shakespeare reference.
More about Tulip.
Romeo and Juliet, correct?
Yes.
So what appears to be happening is a bunch of people who prior to 2016 did not identify themselves as evangelicals kind of absorb the fact that evangelicals are pro-Trump people. And so because they were pro-Trump people, they then started calling themselves evangelical. But it doesn't have any association with the historic or theological definition of what it means to be an evangelical. So it isn't that more people have become evangelicals. It's just that more Trump supporters want to call themselves evangelicals because it's so synonymous now with supporting Donald Trump.
But okay, this is another conclusion of the research. There is no clear evidence that white evangelicals who opposed Trump were more likely than Trump supporters to leave or stop referring to themselves as evangelicals.
Right. And that's what David and I talked about, because there isn't an alternative identity for them to call themselves. So,
okay.
Well, we've talked about that a bunch on this podcast,
right,
because that actually is us. And so, we are still evangelicals. If you want to look at what an evangelical is, that's us. Now, do we like that? I don't want to call myself that. Do you? But,
yes.
Well, yes, in the greater thing. But I don't want to go out there and say, hey, everybody, I'm an evangelical.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is there's now a turd in the punch bowl, and those of us in the punch bowl can't get out of it.
Right.
And now it's time for news of the butt.
That's over. That is
Fortunately, I had a camera in the punch bowl, so I can identify the pooper.
Yeah, and the The anal
Okay.
print was orange.
Oh, thank you very much.
Hmm.
Okay. So different people are running with this in different directions. So the Christian Post, we all are familiar with the Christian Post,
Yes.
which took a turn about just before the last election in being openly Trump supporting rather than closet Trump supporting and defending Trump rather aggressively. So they took a look at this and said, aha, here's what we've learned. And they're the ones who said, since 2016, many have warned that the strong support for Trump found among evangelical leaders and churches threatened to harm the witness of the church. And then they single out Russell Moore. Let's single out Russell Moore. Russell Moore said the damage done to the gospel this year by so-called evangelicals will take longer to recover from than the 1980s TV evangelist scandals. So their conclusion is he was wrong. It didn't do any damage to the church. In fact, it grew the church. Ha ha!
If the
Supporting Trump is good for the church, Sky.
But I mean, that's a ridiculous argument, because it's like saying, hey, this heresy of child sacrifice, it's not going to hurt the church. Look at, there's tons of people coming. They love killing their children. Well, that doesn't, you've destroyed the church because you've departed from the gospel. It doesn't matter how popular it is. And
Amen.
that's what they're mistaking. They think because more people identify as evangelical, that evangelicalism is growing in a normal thing. Well, when you fundamentally change the definition, you're
So,
it's apples and oranges.
so can I just verify who are you comparing to people who sacrifice their
I
children?
don't know. I was trying to think of something abhorrent that we know is clearly against
Okay.
the gospel and the
Okay.
church, but just because it's popular,
Okay.
people think it's great.
So your position is just because people were started identifying as evangelicals, and some have stopped since 2016. A decent chunk of people have stopped self-identifying as evangelical, but more than that have started. So the people who have started are starting largely for political reasons, is
Yeah,
your contention.
Well,
you
and
know,
just because they call themselves evangelical does not mean they've all of a sudden turned a new leaf, are going to church, and are, becoming
Yeah,
spiritually
Yeah, I
formed.
do. I do wonder if in the last 4 years the term evangelical has become, when self-applied, more of an indicator of
Your
cultural
politics.
identity.
mhm.
Yeah. Okay. But here, do you know who Chrissy Stroop is? Do you know who Chrissy
No,
Stroop is?
no.
No.
Chrissy Stroop is a journalist for Religion Dispatches. She is one of the leaders in the ex-vangelical movement. So she was raised very conservative Christian and is now a leading ex-vangelical voice. She wrote about this and said, here's the problem, because pundits are using this data once again to run with the unhelpful narrative that America's conservative, mostly white evangelicals compromise a political identity and movement, not a religious movement. In other words, they're not real evangelicals, the ones that support Trump. Um, and her point is, this is her contention, for the vast majority of white evangelicals, attempting to acquire or maintain the power to enforce what they believe to be God's will in the public square is a religious imperative, one that's not contradicted by their support for former President Donald Trump. Even then, she goes on, even never Trump Republican pundit and consummate respectable evangelical David French is forced to concede that there isn't a stark difference politically between church attending white evangelicals and those who never darken a church's doors. In his blog post on the Pew data. And yet he goes on to put forth the contradictory assertion that theologically evangelical, in other words, real evangelical Americans, represent such a small proportion of white evangelicals overall, a minority of a minority, he laments, that they don't exercise decisive political power. If the Pew findings aren't telling us that the theological purity of white evangelicalism has been diluted with an influx of nominal Christians, then it must be, her contention is that this is what evangelicals have always been and what they've always believed, and this is evangelicalism.
She
So
might be right. She might be right.
she speaks of her own growing up and says, The evangelical embrace of Trump does represent the culmination of a decades-long process in which white evangelical subculture merged with the Republican Party. But this doesn't mean, as French claims, that, quote, the transformation is political and not religious. For me, growing up socialized in evangelical churches and Christian schools, it was always simply taken for granted that being a Christian meant reading the Bible daily, attending church often, praying before meals, before any significant event, and before bed, fighting the culture wars, and when old enough, voting Republican. Our right wing political extremism was a part of our religious identity, completely inextricable from our devotion to the four principles of French's beloved Bebington Quadrilateral.
How do you know how old she is by chance?
60 ish.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. Okay, so I mean, I think what I don't want to put words in David French's mouth, but I think what he and others would argue is that it has been
Well, it
about
sounds like you are putting words in his mouth.
well, I think I don't think they're necessarily saying two different things here. It isn't like Donald Trump showed up in 2016 and suddenly massive numbers of evangelicals fundamentally changed their beliefs in order to accommodate Donald Trump.
Right.
He is the culmination of a 40-year or almost 50-year um, work between the conservative Republican political establishment and evangelicalism that melded more and more and more together, and he's the culmination of it. So it's very possible that somebody 40 years ago grew up in an environment where Christianity and Republican politics were inseparable. It's just that has now kind of taken over more than ever.
Well,
It's reached fruition.
that was me.
Yeah.
I mean, that was me. And, when you look at the Donald Trump Republican Party platform, you hold it side by side to Ronald Reagan's platform, and they are nearly identical down to the slogans. So, Make America Great Again was basically Ronald Reagan's slogan. Their playbook for how to win the election was Ronald Reagan's playbook. And
Yeah, I think the difference was, like, if you go back to 1980, there was still a sizable percentage of white evangelicals in America who would have identified themselves as Democrats.
I
And
remember in Washington and running where most of the Christians that I knew couldn't fathom that a Democrat was a Christian.
Jimmy Carter was president and was a Southern Baptist and actually got a lot of the evangelical vote in 1976. So the switch happened, but it's taken on an extreme form now.
Switch really didn't happen until Jimmy Carter ran for re-election.
That's right.
And
Exactly.
and James Dobson and James Robeson and the LaHays and who else was in that pulled a meeting in
Falwell.
Texas, and Falwell to say, we're not going to support him. We need another candidate to support. Who's going to be the other candidate? And Reagan showed up and said, me. And they said, him. And that was the end of evangelicals supporting Democrats.
But I will tell you, too, I would like to the numbers of the evangelicals supporting Richard Nixon, because when I grew up in those early days of the Republican Party, before Jimmy Carter, it was all evangelicals for Richard Nixon.
Well, yeah, and that's the Southern strategy that he employed.
Especially in the South.
Right.
Not as much. In I grew up in Iowa, and with Nixon, it was more he was the pro-business candidate, and my grandparents were management, not labor. So it was more about economics because the cultural aspects hadn't come into it yet, except in the South where it was states' rights, which was more openly racially tinged. Okay, so the last thing, and this is interesting, would be fun to talk about sometime, but Chrissy Stroop says, growing up evangelical, we cultivated knowledge of the Bible, interpreted in an authoritarian manner. So she finds authoritarianism as central to evangelical theology, which is definitely, that comes up in Kristen DeMay's work. It comes up in Allison, Barr's work, Beth Allison Barr's work. So that's worth unpacking at some point.
For sure.
Yeah, I have a harder time disagreeing with that. I generally see the taint of authoritarianism in a lot of evangelical churches, even among leaders who aren't themselves authoritarian. They reinforce a system and structure that tends to be, even in the way we worship, to be honest.
Well, let me ask you this. When I look back and I think about what you're saying, it is very white male driven. And that goes back to England, right? So there is an authoritarian structure, a male dominated structure that is, in politics, it's in religion, and it's in the home.
Yeah,
And
and
that just,
there was an explicit element to that theologically that developed in the antebellum South, to justify slavery, was that God created this order. He created this order where white males are on top, then white females, then non-white males, and at the very bottom, non-white females. So, and that was, the Bible was used to justify that for at least a century. And that, so you can't just erase the echoes of that, especially as evangelicalism, became more of a Southern movement, and liberal Protestantism became more of a Northern movement in the U.S.
Yeah, and that's what Robert Jones talked about a few weeks ago in my interview with him. Last week, actually.
Go back and listen to it. Go back and listen to the Robert Jones interview. Go back and listen to David French Friday on Friday, and then get excited for the guest we have today, because it's fantastic, right, Sky?
Absolutely. This is a barn burner. Is that the term?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Or a barnstormer, or
Barnstormer?
no, barn burner was when you have so much fun that you burn down someone's barn, because there ain't no more fun than that in your wooden shoes.
I don't know. I like tipping cows. That's pretty fun.
Tipping cows is fun.
This is a cow tipper?
This is a cow tipper. I still don't buy it with the shoes.
Oh, well, I don't know what it's going to take to convince you then, because I've actually shown you photographic evidence.
Yeah,
what
right,
else are you going to believe?
Oh, the Americans are coming to the house. Set out the wooden shoes.
We
They'll
totally
want to see
surprised
them there.
We did not call. This was a surprise knock. They were in there, like lying in their living room on their Sunday afternoon. They weren't prepared for Americans.
Okay, Christian. A bunch of people from Holland, Michigan are mad at me because they wear their wooden shoes at the festivals. Of course you do, because that's when the tourists come.
Maybe the Dutch use wooden shoes because they don't like being snuck up on.
You know what? I almost recorded this guy walking over the driveway, with his wooden shoes, because I thought in my film, one of the American GIs writes home that the kids wear these wooden clogs and they sound like Gordon's milk truck walking on the road.
Yeah.
You could hear them from a long way away. And I thought, I really wonder what that sounds like. But I was too embarrassed.
Maybe that's why the Dutch never really became a superpower. Because
everybody heard them coming?
Everyone heard them coming.
Yeah. Oh, they're coming, and I smell tulips.
I mean, they did have a big navy at one point, but, didn't last that long.
Thanks, everyone, for supporting the show. Thanks for your Patreon support. We really appreciate it. We're having fun meetings this week about what comes next and where we go from here. So it's a fun time to be part of the resistance. The French or the Dutch underground. We're the brave Dutch with our clippy cloppy shoes sneaking up on the Nazis. Clip clop, hello Nazis! And we will see you guys next week.
Bye, everybody.
Let's be honest, there are many parts of the Bible we ignore and topics we think just don't apply to us. And I'm not just talking about weird stuff from the Old Testament about freckles and shellfish. There are things even in the New Testament we ignore. Things like circumcision, which is mentioned in 10 New Testament books, including 13 times in the book of Galatians alone. And yet, when was the last time you heard a sermon or did a Bible study about circumcision? We assume it just has nothing to do with being a Christian in the 21st century. It's just an old leftover from the first century. Throughout September, we've been doing a devotional series in With God Daily, tracking the link between circumcision in the ancient world and consumerism in the modern world. We're exploring how we're tempted to think about our faith as simply a brand that we display, rather than as an identity we inhabit. These 4 weeks on Foreskins will revolutionize not only the way you think about identity, but perhaps even the way you read some critical texts in the New Testament. To be a part of this devotional and to read the archives, you need to visit withgoddaily.com and sign up. You'll get the email devotional 5 days a week, plus the audio devotional, and you can download the mobile app for a better user experience and access to the archives. And we have a whole new user app coming soon that'll have all new features, so you want to get in now. With God Daily is available to anyone who makes a donation of any amount to support our work. So go to withgoddaily.com and discover the daily devotional for people who hate daily devotionals. I can't tell you how excited I've been to talk to our guest today. Philip Yancey is one of the best-selling contemporary Christian authors. He has sold over 15 million books just in English, not counting, I think, the 40 other languages his books have been translated into. And he's helped so many people deconstruct their faith before deconstruction was even a hashtag. But just as importantly, he's helped them discover a more authentic faith on the other side. Philip Yancey has just released his new memoir called Where the Light Fell, and it's a haunting and beautiful story about his own family and childhood, about his journey from a very racist, fundamentalist form of Christianity into a richer, broader, more generous vision of faith in Christ. As you'll hear from our conversation, Philip Yancey's books have had a deep impact on my own faith formation. And I think the questions he asks about faith are the same questions we're struggling with today, which means he has a lot of wisdom to offer us in this moment. I'm so happy that he joined us today. Here is my conversation with Philip Yancey. Philip Yancey, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you very much, Sky.
As I was saying before we started recording, I've been deeply influenced by a lot of your books over the years. I was kind of coming into faith in the 1990s, and your books, The Jesus I Never Knew, What's So Amazing About Grace, were deeply influential. But the book of yours that kind of stood out to me, and I'm bringing this up because it relates a little bit to your latest book, was Soul Survivor. Where I don't know where that ranks in popularity of your books, but for me, it was so important because every chapter of that book, you highlight the biography of some Christian from history that impacted your faith. And it opened me up to a much wider vision of what the faith can be. And I bring it up because now you're writing your own memoir, or you've written your own memoir. And as I read that, it was deeply encouraging. It was painful. It was honest. I was just thrilled with how transparent you were. Why did you feel like it was time to write your story rather than just tell someone else's again, which you did so brilliantly in Soul Survivor?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Soul Survivor, Sky, because whenever somebody asks me of the now 24 books you've written, which is your favorite, the answer is without question, Soul Survivor.
Wow.
And I envy for people the chance that I had to sit down and over the course of a year explore the people who most affected me, who made me a different person, people I wanted to be like, that I learned from. And it was a tremendous exercise, and there were some surprises in there. I learned a lot about Jesus from Mahatma Gandhi, for example, who was not a follower of Jesus in the traditional Christian sense, but had a lot to teach us about how to live out the Sermon on the Mount. Martin Luther King was a great example to me, and a very important figure in my own wokeness from racism that took many years. Why did I decide to write? I've wanted to write this memoir for 40 years. I tell you how it started. I was at a writers' conference, pretty high-level writers' conference. I had just published my first book, Where is God When It Hurts, and was invited to be with people like Catherine Marshall in those days, John and Elizabeth Sherrill, who had published The Hiding Place and Cross and the Switchblade. And there were only, maybe 7 or 8 of us there, so a very intensive time. And John Sherrill was sitting next to me at dinner, and he said, "Well, tell me your story, Philip." And I just kind of started telling him my story in a very matter of fact, this is what happened, and then this is what happened. And suddenly he choked, and I thought he was choking on his food because we were eating dinner, and I realized there was a sob. He started sobbing. And it was the first time I realized I have a story. And, when you grow up, that's what's normal. And you assume that the world is like that. And I had never kind of stepped outside my story and realized this is some pretty bizarre stuff here. and over the years, I had to come to terms with the context I came from, Southern fundamentalism, a pretty dysfunctional family. And I realized that was one of the gifts that I had. I was given this gift of an unusual circumstance. And I learned a lot from Frederick Buechner, who was one of my mentors, who's mentioned in Soul Survivor. And he kept saying, really, all we have is our life. That there's no reason to write if you can't somehow show a distinction that of your point of view compared to anybody else's. Otherwise, we don't need your voice. We don't need your life. And it took him years to come to terms with his own life because it involved his father's suicide. And it has taken me years to come to terms with some of the things, some of the characters in my family, because they're going to be hurt by telling stories. I'm trying to tell them as truthfully as possible. And I realized that there are a lot of people who go through a tough church experience, for example, and then toss it all away. And I did that. There are a lot of memoirs that record that, making fun of the church. And I, many times when I read those books, I think, oh man, my church experience was much worse than yours.
Right.
And I did throw it away, but it has a redemptive aspect because I found my way back, and with God's sense of humor, ended up as a Christian writer working for Christianity Today and other kind of mainstream publications.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I found the memoir so timely. Uh, Everywhere I go, I'm bumping in, especially to young adults who are quote unquote deconstructing their faith. They're reacting to some of the narrowness of their Christian upbringing, some of the baggage of the evangelical subculture. We talk about it regularly on our podcast. And when I read your story, and I knew some of it because you've shared it in other places, but not certainly in this depth and transparency. When I read your story, I did think, if anybody has a justifiable reason to walk away from the faith, from the church, from the ridiculousness of some of the American church subculture, it's you. And yet you found, even in some of those darkest pieces, part of God's grace. And it did parallel a bit what you did in Soul Survivor. You mentioned earlier how Mahatma Gandhi has something to say to us about following Jesus. And there are numerous other people you profile in Soul Survivor who are either not a Christian or from a stream of Christianity, which is not, indigenous to you or to me. And when I read that book, coming from a multi-ethnic background, a very diverse religious background, it gave me permission to look for God's grace in places that the church didn't often say it existed. And similarly with your memoir, you find grace in places that other people, I think, would struggle to find it. I want to begin where you begin in the book, which is the tragic story of your father's passing when you were very, very young. My maternal grandfather was a psychiatrist here in Chicago, and he died when I was about 10 years old, but some of his wisdom has been passed down to me through my mother and my uncles and stuff. And apparently one of the things my grandfather often used to say as a psychiatrist was, show me a child who never suffered and I'll show you a very shallow adult. The suffering that you experienced as a kid is written about throughout the memoir, but in particular, the story of your father's passing. Can you share a little bit about that and the circumstances that you learned about when you were later a college student that impacted your faith formation?
Right. I was only 1 year old when my father died, so I have no memories of him whatsoever. I really didn't know my father. And I had a brother who's 3 years old, and he has just a few childhood memories. But of course, we were deeply affected by his death. My mother was a widow who was really unprepared for life. She didn't know how to drive, had never written a check, just didn't know how life worked. And she was also crushed because they were planning to be missionaries in Africa, had prepared for that, had a mailing list, had supporters lined up. And then the pandemic of polio was going on back then. About 50,000 people a year were either dying or paralyzed through polio. And my father was one of the unlucky ones. Most people were not paralyzed. Most people were children who got the disease, but he got it as a 23-year-old man and was completely paralyzed, couldn't even breathe on his own. So he was put into an iron lung where he stayed for about 2 months. And it was a miserable 2 months. He didn't get good care. It was kind of a charity hospital. He was just lying there, could only look at the ceiling, couldn't barely move his head a little bit. And his only lifeline really was my mother, who would come in and sit beside him every day and do what she could. And he left that hospital and went to a chiropractic center, which was not really equipped to deal with polio patients, and died 9 days later, just a few days later. That's the story I knew growing up, and it had its own ramifications because my mother, in a story very much like Hannah and Samuel in the Old Testament, gave her son to God and kind of gave him away. And we were told at a certain point that my mother was giving us to God to replace our father as a missionary in Africa. It was that specific. And that's when you're a child. That sounds fun. Africa. I think I'll go there and see all those wild animals, and sure, I'll be a missionary. And it didn't turn out that way. And we can talk about some of those ramifications later. But when I was a college student, about 18 years old, I had a girlfriend who later became my wife. And last year we celebrated our 50th anniversary. So it's a long term marriage. Very
Congratulations.
first time, thank you. Very first time I took her over to the grandparents' house. And she was interested in other Yanceys and the relatives and the story of the family. So they pulled out some scrapbooks and photo albums. We were going through one of the scrapbooks, and then an old newspaper clipping fell out. And I reached down to pick it up, and it was an article I had never seen from the Atlanta Constitution and another one from the Philadelphia Inquirer, where my mother came from. And they told the story that the reason my father left the hospital, the charity hospital, and was moved to a chiropractic center was because they had this mailing list of 5,000 people, and they became convinced that he would be healed, physically healed. I don't know if there were any healings of polio going on back then, but they believed, why would God possibly take a person committed to be a missionary at that age? And so it was an act of faith. It was an act of desperate faith. He was not comfortable in the hospital. He wasn't getting good treatment. So they gambled everything, believing that God would heal. And this was a stunning revelation to me because it put a whole different light on the family story I had grown up with. And I realized why finding some way to replace my father was so important for my mother, because she had participated along with him in this gamble for his life, believing they knew God's will. And I learned that's a very dangerous thing when we take on the prerogative of God, deciding what is God's will and what is not God's will, especially in a life and death matter like that. So that became an explanation of a lot that had puzzled me over the years.
So let's unpack two pieces of that story. First of all, your mother's response to the passing of her husband and their missionary plans. She takes that dream that she had with her husband and she projects it upon you and your brother. That somehow
Right.
you are going to redeem the loss of your father by filling the ministry role that he was unable to because of his early death. What impact did that have on you and your brother and your faith formation? I've talked to parents, I've talked to grandparents over the years as I've spoken in different places, and they with great pride will sometimes tell me, I pray for my children or my grandchildren every day that they will become, pastors or missionaries. And I tell them to their face that I'm praying that you'll become a pastor or missionary. And I know they mean it with the best of intent, but I grieve inside when I hear those stories because I
Mm.
worry about the burden that they're putting on their young people. And sometimes do they enter into ministry vocations not because of a genuine calling or gifting, but out of a sense of obligation and duty? How did you and your brother react to your mother telling you those things?
You're right, and it's not just Christians who go through that. I have Jewish friends or Chinese friends, and if you don't become a doctor, you're a failure. Your life
Right.
is scripted for you from birth. And however, when it's a holy calling like that, then it notches things up a level. And when we were young, we thought, well, that would be cool. We were in the church community, and you rise in the ranks by by becoming part of that church community. What happened, Sky? Several things happened. One was we realized at a certain point when we became teenagers that the church we went to had some problems. It was not an ideal church. It was openly racist, and I spelled that out in the book. It was proudly fundamentalist, uh, allied with Bob Jones University. That would be kind of the place on the map. Very suspicious of Billy Graham, King James only, one of those kind of churches. And one by one, some of those cardinal doctrines of the church started getting a little fuzzy to both my brother and I and me. And we realized that the church had really misrepresented truth in some of those ways. They certainly lied to us about race. They were actually teaching the curse of Ham theory, that Ham was cursed by God to serve in the tents of Shem. And so therefore people of color could never rise above it. They could never be a CEO. They could never be a PhD. They're very good at serving occupations. And this was taught from the pulpit and summer camps. And as a kid, you believe what the adults teach you. And then later we got outside that bubble and realized they had lied to us. And if they lied about that, did they lie about the Bible? Did they lie about Jesus? So we went through kind of a questioning phase, my brother and I separately. And then he took it much further. He became one of Atlanta's original hippies, dropped out of Wheaton College and started taking LSD and growing his hair long, living in a commune. And my mother reacted in a very shrill fashion. She felt like she was certainly losing her sons and her ideals of what they should be. And she was also losing this vow that she made to God, that she had oriented her whole life around. She did work hard to raise us, and she had, in some ways, some unusual child rearing techniques that I spell out in the book.
Yeah.
But she worked very hard. I give her credit for that, and I believe did her best. But when she sensed that she was losing the grip, and she was certainly losing the sacred vow that she had made to God, she turned on us, and we really haven't done anything to please her since then. And I tell her, I've been to Africa. My books are in Africa now. So I made it there. But she doesn't buy it. I never followed the script that was ordained for me by her.
That seems to be a quality of fundamentalism in general, just the inflexibility. The script is laid out, the rules are defined, and there's a little ability to flex with that, despite the fact that you've become a Christian writer, influenced countless people through your teaching and writing, including globally. It doesn't count. It doesn't fit the script, which is
Right.
incredibly disappointing. The other aspect of your father's passing was the faith healing piece of it. This trust that if he left that hospital and went to the chiropractor's clinic instead, and these 5,000 people are praying for him, certainly God would hear that prayer and answer it and heal him. How did learning about that aspect of his passing as a college student affect your understanding of God? And how did that mesh with your own work of trying to parse what was true and false from the church of your upbringing? Did that fact about your father's passing was it like an atomic bomb going off in that middle of that process, or did it steer you in actually a positive direction?
It steered me to ask questions. And when I started out as a young journalist, I was working at a magazine called Campus Life magazine, which ultimately became part of Christianity Today.
Right.
And when I would go around the country, and I was then part of Youth for Christ, and Youth for Christ directors would line me up with the most sensational story in their area. And I would numerous times write them up for Reader's Digest. They had a a column called Drama in Real Life. People attacked by grizzly bears, lost in blizzards, just one thing after another, tree falls on them. And when I would interview these people again and again, they would say, I was just in the hospital trying to recover, trying to stay alive and doing everything I could. What made it worse was visitors from the church. They would come in with these confusing words. Some would say, God is punishing you. You did something terribly wrong. You need to confess. And some would say, you don't have enough faith. If you just had enough faith, you would be healed. You'd be able to walk out tomorrow. And others would say, no, it's not God. It's the devil. The devil is attacking you. And others would say, no, it's not the devil. It's God, but not because he's punishing you. He's chosen you as an example, and you can be a super Christian to show the way for the rest of us. And I didn't know. I'm just a kid. I don't know the answers to those questions. So that launched me on my first book, which was Where is God When It Hurts? That is the question. And I realize now, looking back, that my two themes, the themes that come up over and over in my writing, come right out of my life, as you would expect. One is suffering and one is grace. And those became combined. One of the first mentors, really, that I had was a man named Dr. Paul Brand. We ended up writing 3 books together, very different than I was. He was in his 60s, the prime of his career. He was a British surgeon who had lived most of his life in India at that point. And I followed him around. And when my own faith was still in a fog, I piggybacked on his faith. I could write about him with confidence. I couldn't write about myself with confidence. And it gave me a 10-year incubation period to do just what you said, to decide what should be kept and what should be discarded of the faith that I grew up among. So that was a critical growth point for me. You mentioned what are often called ex-vangelicals. A friend of mine said he thinks there are probably 25 to 30 million people like that in the United States, raised in an evangelical environment, probably were true believers at one point, but then started questioning some of the shrill attitudes, some of the judgment, some of the politics, and some of the anti-science, and then for various reasons distance themselves. And they still haven't landed. They don't know where they're going to end up. There's something very wistful about growing up in that environment. But on the other hand, there are some danger spots too. And I didn't grow up in an evangelical. I grew up in a fundamentalist environment, so it was even worse. And my life of writing has been sorting through what's worth keeping and what should I not keep.
Yeah, as a writer, I think we undermine how therapeutic it is. It is the process by which we are trying to wrestle with our own faith and stories and history. I certainly do that. I've not written memoir or biography as much, but I remember my father reading my book for the first time. And he said to me, he kind of laughed at the end of it all. And his comment to me was, there's a lot more of me in you than I realized. My father's not a Christian. And he said, I always assumed your mother had the greater influence on you because she's the Christian and I'm not. But when he read he realized there's a whole lot of me in you, meaning skepticism and inquiry and not buying a lot of the hoopla around cultural religion. And it's true. I think in that book, I was kind of working out that aspect of who I am in my story. And the process you had of kind of following Dr. Brand and watching his faith and learning from him, for those who haven't read those books of yours or the work you've done with Dr. Brand, can you just briefly summarize his approach to suffering and pain, the perspective he has as a leprosy doctor, and how you apply that to your own story?
Yes, he was the one really who established that this disease, which is the oldest recorded disease and a greatly feared disease. When you say leprosy, people think of movies they've seen where patients are missing fingers and maybe even a whole hand, amputations, they're blind. And all those are common manifestations of the disease. But Dr. Brand proved decisively that all of that abuse came simply because those with leprosy lack pain. So they lack that warning system that keeps you from reaching your hand into a fire, that forces you to blink every few seconds. And if you just keep your eyes open all day long, force them to stay open, they'll eventually dry out and you'll go blind. So millions of leprosy patients have gone blind simply because they don't blink anymore. They lack that little signal that says blink, blink, blink. And he was the first person I met who said, thank God for pain. If I had one gift to give to my leprosy patients, it would be the gift of pain. And I had spent my life trying to figure out suffering. Couldn't think of anything good about it. I read lots of books on the problem of pain, the problem of suffering, but never one called The Gift of Pain. And ultimately, the two of us together ended up writing one. And it shifted my focus from why did these things happen, which I don't think the Bible gives us much wisdom about. Job wanted that wisdom very badly, and he never got it from God. God just said, no, that's not your job. That's my job. Your job is, now that they have happened, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to respond? Are you going to trust me or reject me? Uh, is there something redemptive that can come out of this suffering? And looking back, there is pain in my childhood. It was kind of a major theme that I wasn't aware of, but there it was. And yet it has been redeemed. And even the kind of church experience I grew up in, that's been useful. I'm grateful for the Bible knowledge I learned. I'm grateful for the habits of discipline that I learned. Uh, those have come in a very valuable sense to me in my career as a writer. However, not everybody makes it to the other side. The other story that's prominent in my memoir, Where the Light Fell, is the story of my brother who took a very different path. And a lot of those ex-evangelicals out there are like my brother. They were wounded in some way. Maybe they were gay, maybe they were too smart, and the church kind of picked on them or pushed them away. And they retain something of that thirst for grace and forgiveness and love. But the church gets in the way. The church instead presents judgment and competition and legalism. And I find myself as a writer kind of caught in between there, because that's where I was for many years, and in some ways still am.
So the ambivalence I feel a little bit about your memoir and what you just described as the church's judgment and lack of grace, it's captured a little bit in your mother's story. She goes through the trauma of losing her husband tragically early. She's widowed with these two little boys, and she appears to also be kind of searching for some kind of redemptive grace in this pain.
Right.
What's the good that's going to come out of this? And in her fundamentalist framework, it's, well, God's going to take my two sons and use them for his kingdom in a significant way. And so she grasps at that, not knowing the way that message could unfairly burden you and your brother or shape. But it was done, no doubt, with the best of intent. And sometimes I look at the church and its failings right now, and I oscillate between just anger and frustration over the way the church is captivated by ridiculous lies or conspiracies, its failure to show grace, its judgmentalism. But then I also go to the other side and go, these are people doing the best they can. They're struggling themselves, and they're looking for answers and solutions and certainties that maybe the scripture doesn't give us and the faith doesn't give us. And in their pursuit of that comfort and that certainty, they don't realize the collateral damage they're doing. When you look at the world today, the church today, the interesting realities of a pandemic and the racist reactions and white supremacy and Christian nationalism, all the other craziness going on right now, what words of wisdom do you have for us based on your own story when you look at the state of the American church right now?
Well, one of the advantages of age is that you've seen things like this happen before. And when I look back, who would have thought that evangelicalism would have become kind of a national phenomenon. The year of the evangelical, back when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and then the moral majority and all that. And I've seen it go through these phases where Jesus predicted that the Spirit moves kind of like the wind. You never know where it's coming from and where it's going. And when I look, the charismatic movement came out of nowhere. I mean, when I grew up, we were very anti-charismatic. We thought that was a form of demon possession or something. And we had no place for gifts of the Spirit at all. And then this global, worldwide movement, so that almost half of Christians in the world identify in some ways with it, came out of nowhere. And the Jesus movement, if you chose one group of people least likely to start a revival, it would be those dirty, long-haired California hippies.
Right.
And yet it did, And I've seen that. And I guess the one that really distresses me, especially going on right now, is the identification with politics. Because when I grew up, we were really pretty apolitical tribe. We were about living our lives here to get ready for the next life. And politics was part of this life, it was part of the world. And there weren't many Christians who were capable of living in that world. And then Jerry Falwell and other people came along and made it a hallmark, identifying hallmark, Focus on the Family, James Dobson, those people. And now, if you say the word evangelical to a reporter from the New York Times, they immediately think in political terms. And that's very sad to me because when I read the New Testament, Jesus was rather dismissive of politics. Politics were so different back then, of course, the Roman Empire. Paul knew how to use them, but again, wasn't that concerned with what those powers are doing. He's concerned with counter powers, working kind of from the bottom up, from the grass level up. And so I am distressed about the identification. And I'm also distressed that we're losing moral leadership. We miss a Billy Graham type figure who was an inclusive, compassionate, understanding figure. We've splintered, and then, of course, through various scandals, some of our most prominent spokespeople have turned out to have great feet of clay. We shouldn't be surprised about that. That's always been true. It's true in the Bible as well. But the social media and media in general seize on that and say, "Wow, look at those Christians! Look at those evangelicals! They're just a bunch of fakes. They're not sincere." We got some work cut out for us, and I think we need to bring the good news back into the word evangelical. I don't know if it's even possible, but whether we use the word evangelical or not, we need to present the message of God as a father wanting to get his family back. That is the message, I think, of the entire Bible, and encapsulated in Jesus' story of the prodigal son. That's the image of God that Jesus wants us to have. That father aching because his own son whom he loves, has gone away, and just wanting them to be restored, to be welcomed again with a banquet, with a party.
So decades ago, you were in a way one of those prodigal sons, wrestling with your identity, wrestling with your faith, trying to differentiate what was worth keeping, what was worth rethinking or jettisoning. You mentioned that there may be 30 million ex-vangelicals out there right now who are in that process. What do you have to say to them about that journey? What would you encourage them to do, and what would you warn them to avoid as they try to parse through what's true in the faith worth retaining and what they need to let go of?
In my case, I did not come back to the faith because of some Christian book that I read. I had read all those books, I had heard all those sermons. I could quote the Bible, and there was really no way I can imagine that God could speak to me through the traditional paths of a Billy Graham sermon or reading John 3:16 or something like that. I had gone forward, accepted Jesus as my Savior dozens of times. And when you've done that dozens of times, you realize what's the difference between what's play acting and what's real. You don't know anymore. And I was graced. I tell my conversion story in there. I was graced at a time when I wasn't seeking it, but I was softened. Frankly, that book title, "Where the Light Fell," comes from St. Augustine, who said, I was unable to look directly at the sun, but I could look on where the light fell. And where the light fell for me was a softening that took place in three ways. Uh, the beauties of nature. Nature has always spoken to me. And when I was a lonely child in a confused family, my solace was to go out into the woods and spend time with the animals and the beauties of nature. Classical music. My brother was much better pianist than I was, but at least I had enough to appreciate it and just to be stunned by the beauty of it. And romantic love, those three things: nature, music, and love. That's where the light fell for me. And so there was a softening process. And I guess I would say to those 30 million people, um, you need to understand, as G.K. Chesterton used to say, he'd say the worst moment for an atheist is when he is thankful but has no one to thank, when he feels a sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. And I guess that's a state I found myself in. I was experiencing common grace through those three things: through nature, through music, and love. And instinctively, I realized those things don't just happen automatically. There's also evil. There are other things. Where did these things come from? And what do they tell us about the world, about the Creator? And eventually, God did meet me. It was in an unexpected way, but the preparation was just correcting that vision of God. My vision of God growing up was the scowling policeman trying to keep you from having a good time, smashing rebels. And I guess if I gave one word of advice to those people, I would say, judge God by Jesus. Don't judge God by the church. Get to know Jesus. He blows your mind. He's revolutionary. In all of his stories, the wrong person is the hero. He's full of compassion, yet he's full of fire for justice. And all these things that are causes floating around in our culture right now: anti-racism and anti-poverty and anti-homelessness and all. These are the reason we care about these things. Really comes out of Jesus. That's where it started. Wherever I go in the world where there have been Christians, there are schools and hospitals and orphanages and people digging wells and people who are fighting sexual trafficking. These are people who are followers of Jesus. And then the world kind of wakes up and joins the crusade. But to a cause, they're started by Christians. And we've lost that. People in the United States don't think of that when you say the word evangelical. They think of, in some cases, the opposite.
Indeed. So a few weeks ago, I interviewed Kara Powell, who's a friend of mine. She's the director of the Fuller Youth Institute. She spent years researching teenagers. And of
Right.
course, a lot of young people would probably consider themselves in that ex-vangelical or in that process of deconstructing. And in our conversation, she was relaying to me what a teenager had said to her that kind of stuck in her mind during an interview. This teen said, "I'm tired of the church answering questions I'm not asking." And the reason I bring that up as we wrap up our time together, Philip, is that when I look over the list of your books, even some of them on my own shelf, some of those books are 30 years old, maybe 40 years old at this point. And yet
They are.
your books are always asking the questions that we are constantly asking. And the questions about where's God when it hurts? What is Jesus really like compared to the one you were presented as a kid? What is so amazing about grace? Does prayer really work and make any difference? Like you've been a voice for so many of us because the questions you're asking, I know they're your own questions, but they're the questions that
Right.
matter. And I'm just incredibly grateful for the honesty with which you've engaged those questions, your willingness to say you don't know, at times, unlike so
Right.
many in the church who want to give a definitive answer for everything, and for introducing us to other voices like you did in Soul Survivor, and
Mm.
being a guide for the rest of us to continue to explore and grow. That is just an amazing gift. And that continues with your memoir, Where the Light Fell. It was a joy to
Mm.
read. And you're a beautiful writer beyond just the content of what you're saying. So I can't recommend the book enough to our readers. I think they'll be
Mm.
deeply encouraged by it. And if they are themselves struggling with deconstructing their faith, or figuring out what to keep or lose, or looking back on their life and asking where was God's grace in this, your memoir is a great tale of all of those things. So thank you so much for writing it.
Mm. Well, I feel very blessed, Sky. One time I likened what I do to trying to find a path through a jungle. I'm in some Central American country, and I know there's an ocean out there somewhere. I want to get there, and I'm hacking away with my machete, just working and working. Then finally, boom, I see the ocean. Wow, this is great. I found it. And I look behind me, and to my surprise, there are a lot of other people coming down the same path saying, thank you, thank you. And you're right. I write my books because I need to find that path for myself, because I saw inauthentic faith so many times. I wanted to find a really authentic faith. And I feel so blessed to be able to have a career, to make a living exploring questions that I would have explored anyway. I mean, we writers have an advantage, as you know. Um, a lot of people only think about God at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. We get to do it all day long, every day, if we're struggling with a book. And so we're blessed. And it is an example of the redemption that can come out of pain, which I deeply felt and have experienced. I lived under law for a while, but I've lived under grace a much longer time, and feel very grateful for that.
Yeah, well, and I'm grateful to have been one of those people following you on that path through the jungle. Thank you for cutting it for me. Philip Yancey, thanks for your time, and best wishes as this book rolls out. I hope that you encounter a lot of other people who are blessed by it, and you're encouraged to keep writing. Thank you so much.
I appreciate the time, Sky.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.